So I am Alice Savoie, and this is my colleague Dorine Sauzet. Thanks very much to ATypI for having us this morning. Can you hear me well in the microphone? Yeah, good. So the plan this morning is to present you with an ongoing research project that Dorine and me are currently leading at the Art and Design School of Amiens in partnership with the Printing Museum in Lyon in France. Our research is essentially based on the archives of the type designer, a teacher, a writer, Ladislas Mandel, who before his death 10 years ago donated his archives to the Printing Museum, the Musée de l'Imprimerie in Lyon. Ladislas Mandel died in 2006, and a huge amount of work still remains to be done on his archives to understand his contribution to type design. Thank you. Yeah, that's better. To understand his contribution to type design both in France and internationally as well. So we will start today with providing a short biographical introduction of Mandel before focusing on one particular aspect of his work, as Indra said, which are the typefaces he designed for telephone directories. So Mandel is an important figure of the recent history of type design in France. He became one of the very few French designers to who managed to build an international career in the 1980s, together with people like Albert Botton, José Mendoza, at a time when there was virtually no more type industry in France. You have to remember that pretty much all the type foundries had closed in France in the 1970s, by the end of the 1970s. So Mandel started his career in 1954 at Deberny and Peignot with Adrian Frutiger. And his first main task at the foundry was to assist Frutiger in designing and producing all the variants of the Univers family, as well as other typefaces for phototypesetting. You see them here working together with Lucette Girard, who she was the other valuable assistant of Frutiger at Deberny and Peignot. The task of completing all the variants of Univers took them several years, and it allowed the team to develop some very interesting design processes for phototypesetting, and that's something I touched upon during my talk at ATypI 2 years ago in Barcelona, and that's actually how I got initially interested in the work of Mandel and in his archives as I was doing my PhD research on typefaces for the Lumitype, and then I managed to drag Dorine into working on this with me. Ladislas succeeded Adrian Frutiger as head of the design studio at Deberny and Peignot in 1958, and he remained there until the closure of the studio in 1975. During that time, Mandel led a team of designers and draftsmen, including a number of women. You see him here working with Christiane Randon and Annette Celzo, who worked with him for a number of years. During those 17 years, under the supervision of Mandel, the studio designed a number of custom typefaces as well as some original designs. I'll just show very few of them here. So you have Antique Press, which was a sans serif family for newspapers, and it was derived from the design of Univers. Cancellaresca, very different style, which was a revival of Arrighi's calligraphic models. And Aurelia, another, again, different style, which was a humanistic serif typeface, which is actually very significative of the style that Mandel would later develop in his type designs. You will see a bit more later. This is Ladislas Mandel's CV. We just wanted to show it here because we found it interesting that he claimed as part of his achievements to have created the profession of type designer for phototypesetting in its specificity in Europe in 1954. That shows how significant were these foundation years to him as he entered the business in the early days of phototypesetting. They were really pioneering at the time. But I think it's also revealing of his personality and his need for professional recognition as he tried to make a name for himself after working in the shadow of Adrian Frutiger for many years. After the closure of the design studio in the mid-1970s, Mandel set off to work as an independent designer. He became more involved in the typographic community at the time. He started giving a lot of talks in France and abroad, and he was probably trying to build his public profile as he was looking for work. By then, he had also become particularly interested in the question of designing for analog and digital phototypesetting, and that was obviously a hot topic in the 1970s. And that was precisely the subject of Mandel's talk for the Graphicus conference in Turin in 1976. The talk was entitled Typographic Quality and Phototypesetting. And after this presentation, Mandel got commissioned by the Italian company Seat Pagine Gialle for a very interesting and rather ambitious project, which was to design a new typeface for their telephone directories. And this first commission as an independent designer would really turn out to be a turning point in Mandel's career. Throughout the next 20 years, he would spend a large amount of his time designing typefaces for directories all over Europe, as well as for the US. And working in this kind of niche area enabled him to develop a very distinctive style, also a very distinctive design process, as well as some interesting theories on nonlinear reading processes. I will now let Dorine tell you more about these aspects.
So you can see here a tiny glimpse at the archival boxes containing Mandel's drawing, which are now kept at the Printing Museum in Lyon. With Alice, we spent a considerable amount of time cataloging the content of these boxes. And they contain a lot of manuscripts, a bit of correspondence, and a huge number of drawings, including the original drawings for the typefaces Mandel produced for various telephone directories. For this talk and for the initial phase of our research, we have decided to focus on Mandel's first and most emblematic commission, which is the Galfra typeface family, as we said, originally commissioned by Seat for Italian directories in the late 70s. As already mentioned, Mandel gave a talk in Turin on the issue of designing typefaces for phototypesetting, and this presentation triggered the commission of a new typeface for telephone directories. Indeed, this presentation would have come at the right time for Seat. The first phototypesetting machines had already entered the market in the 50s, but in the late 70s, the issue of converting from hot metal to phototypesetting technologies and to cathode ray tube in particular was very much at the heart of the concerns of many companies, including Seat. The conversion from one technology to another obviously had some huge economical implications for these companies. In fact, Seat was not alone in this. At the same period, a bit earlier in 1974, the American company AT&T commissioned Mergenthaler and Matthew Carter to design the now famous Bell Centennial, having to face similar challenges. And when switching from line casting to CRT phototypesetting, AT&T found out that its iconic typeface Bell Gothic was not suited to the new technology, which triggered the commission of the new face. In a similar fashion, until then, Seat had been typesetting its phone books on linotype using the Delia typeface, you can see on the screen, a design from the early 60s by the Italian foundry Simoncini. In all likelihood, Seat faced similar challenges as AT&T when converting to CRT technologies, and they turned to Mundel for a solution. Consequently, the initial brief from Seat to Mundel was for a new typeface adapted to CRT phototypesetting. It required that the legibility of the design be improved compared to Delia, as well as an economy of space of 3 to 4%, which was very ambitious, actually. So Mandel set off to work, closely analyzing Delia as a starting point. He really admired the readability of the typeface in very small sizes, But he also found that some of its most pronounced features made sense for line casting, but became a hindrance in phototype setting. You can see here details such as the openings at certain junctions or the V serif and the flight baseline also. Such features tended to disappear under the ink squash in metal, but became too present in phototype setting. Mandel was also keen to conceive a set of typefaces specifically adapted to non-linear reading. To him, this was another crucial aspect of the brief. He often talked about how crucial it was to get the typography of a phone book right, and he said that in case of emergency, someone with poor literacy skills still had to be able to find the right phone number as quickly and easily as possible. He said, being neither an aesthetic object nor an art book, the telephone directory is an industrial product of social communication. Humdrum typography, run-of-the-mill typography, the telephone directory has always been neglected by publishers and has never really inspired typographers. However, the telephone, which has become more democratic and which has penetrated every social environment, can be considered a favored means of communication in the modern world. As such, the directory takes up the role of a real public utility. A phone book was not to be read horizontally like a novel, but rather Mandel spoke of a fast, selective, and vertical exploration. The eye of the reader scanned through the left of the column, from top to bottom, looking for a specific surname. Only once the surname is found, will the eye move horizontally to find the right first name, and then, in a third step, it will move further right to find the one specific phone number it was looking for. Consequently, the layout of the phone book and its type had to be conceived alongside each other in order to achieve the best possible results and facilitate this vertical skimming. It was decided, for instance, that similar surnames would not be repeated, but would only appear once. The repetition was suggested by this little chevron you can see here and an indent of 3 letters. Similarly, it was important that different variants help identify different functions and to think a cohesive typographic system rather than just a single typeface. So the initial planning for the typeface involved the design of 4 variants you can see here on the screen. There are 3 for the text and 1 for titling. You see on the screen the series which are named 47, 55, 65 and titling. And you can see that the text variants followed the Univer numbering system. But now we will have a closer look at the design. As already mentioned, Mundel was influenced by Delia to a certain extent, and he studied it carefully as a basis. Actually, we found some of his early drawings in the archives, which are based on Delia. He found that 2 variants were clearly not enough to help the reader navigate in the text, so he thought that this was creating some kind of visual fog and that more hierarchy was needed. We say he, but of course Mundel was not working alone in this. He would have been discussing these ideas with people at SEAT, including Italian designer Piero De Macchi, who was involved with SEAT as a typographic consultant. But unfortunately, as we said, we only have a few correspondents, so that means that we don't have a lot of information about this collaborative aspect. What is even more unfortunate is that the company which has recently bought SEAT has not allowed Piero De Macchi to tell us anything about the history of the project, about his involvement, so that's very frustrating for us to not have those informations. This proof you can see on the screen. This shows a one-to-one comparison of Delia and Galfra with similar leading. So you can see how the variations in the weight and proportions on the right help create visual hierarchy between all the different levels of information, which was really important to Mundel, as we said. The need for a strong hierarchy guided Mundel in this choice of weight, width, and overall proportions. He wanted a clear differentiation between the different variants. So the easiest one on the left was intended for surnames, the normal one for first names, and the more condensed one here on the right was aimed at setting addresses. In order to achieve maximum sharpness and legibility even in rough printing conditions, Mandel opted for a design with flared stems, and we will see later how this translated to CRT technology. He also introduced bigging traps to avoid black spots, but he didn't disconnect certain parts like it was the case in Delia. This is a photograph that will give you a sense of the scale at which Mandel was drawing and the level of sharpness achieved, which is really impressive in my sense. Just as a side note, we have been trying to establish whether Mandel drew all these characters by himself or whether he got help. As far as we could see, the first variants of Galfra for Italy were all drawn by him, but we think that later in his career he got help from a man called Patrick Croissant. We see here how Mandel dealt with the issue of vertical proportions. Galfra has some very short ascenders and descenders so that the typeface can have a large excite, larger counters, and be set with very tight leading, allowing to set more lines per page. For Mandel, in this context of fast selective reading, the goal was not to produce homogeneous word shapes, as it will be the case in continuous reading. It was actually more important to emphasize the difference between letters to help the reader identify them. Accented capital letters were dealt with in an interesting way as well. You can see here on the bottom that they were designed much shorter so that the accent could be added to the top without causing clashes with tight line spacing. Mandel also had an interesting way of dealing with weight and contrast, as you can see here in this very bold version. The typeface looks almost monolinear, with some very distinct thinner parts at junctions, for instance, but we can feel a strong horizontal axis, and it feels as if some weight was slightly added to the top horizontal parts of letters. It's something you find in other French designs of the period, such as Antique-Olive, of course. We also know that the theories of French ophthalmologist Louis-Émile Javal were widely known and discussed among the typographic community in France at the time. And we are now wondering how much this influenced the designers of the generation. So this is something we are currently investigating.
Some technological considerations also obviously had a big impact on the design process for Galfra. As we said at the beginning, the commission was triggered partly by the change of technology from hot metal to CRT phototypesetting. The new Italian directories were to be set on the Digiset, which you see here, which was invented by Rudolf Hell in 1965. And the Digiset was actually the first machine to use digitized fonts for image generation on a CRT, on a cathode ray tube. This is a quote from Lawrence Wallis, which I think summarizes some of the issues with the technology. He said, people recall the pronounced jaggies and staircasing at the edges of the characters, which stimulated a great deal of adverse contemporary comments. Since Galfra was to be used at a very small point size, somewhere between 5 and 6 points, on cheap paper and with a pretty coarse resolution, also to increase printing speed, Mandel found that resolution pretty difficult to handle in terms of type design. So as a result, he decided to manually convert his designs from outlines to bitmaps in the hope that he could retain the greatest the greatest degree of control, over his design. And he called this process pre-digitization. This way, he wanted to make sure that only him would define the rendering of his letter forms rather than let it be defined by the machine, so to say. So what you see here are all the successive steps that were involved in Mandel's drawing process in order to translate his drawings into bitmaps. So you have all the steps from original drawings in pencil, then he was inking them, then he made pre-digitized letter forms, again pencil and then ink drawings, and then could try to run it on the machine and get a proof of the letter. He was doing this for every single letter of every single variant, and all by hand, which must have taken a considerable amount of time. The process was very tedious and methodical, as you can imagine, with Mandel going as far as editing single bitmaps on the proofs in order to improve the rendering. So the red marks here meant that one more pixel was to be added. The green one meant that the pixel was to be removed. This is actually for a later variant, which was added for the US directories, but he did the same for the early versions as well. We know that Matthew Carter used a similar method for Belcentennial, so this should be mentioned here. What we don't know is to which extent Ladislas Mandel was aware of Matthew's working process. Belcentennial was designed shortly before Galfra, so there is a good chance that Mandel would have known about it, but so far we couldn't find anything about Belcentennial in Mandel's archives or any reference to it. And this is something again that we need to investigate, and that's been kind of part of our issue with dealing with archives that contain a huge amount of documents, but mostly drawings, and actually very little correspondence or very little indications of how all these drawings were produced. And then the last aspect of Ladislas Mandel's work we would like to focus on involves some interesting cultural considerations that we wanted to bring out here. Seat's commission to Mandel in 1978, as we said, led to the creation of the first 4 variants of Galfra, which were successfully used in Italian directories from the late 1970s onwards. And following this success, other countries started to inquire either to use Galfra or started to commission Mandel for new typefaces to use in their own directories. So commissions came from various European companies, later from the US as well. And in some cases, new variants of Galfra were produced. But according to Mandel, Galfra showed its limits at some point, and it soon became clear that one design could not fit all countries, nor could it fit all cultures. He observed that in writing, the shape of the letters, their rhythm, their color, expresses the characteristics of a certain cultural identity. And he said that every visual perception must pass through the filters of our psychological structure, which is shaped by our education and culture. So apparently, what we could gather is that his investigations showed some enthusiastic acceptance of his designs at times, but some other times his designs were strongly rejected. And apparently, these reactions varied clearly from one country to another. And this became especially clear when he got commissioned by the company ATypI to design a new set of fonts for its directories in the mid-1980s. ATypI was active in a number of countries all over Europe. And the conclusion of their investigation was that in spite of the proximity of the different Western cultures, if the character designed for the Italian directory appears in perfect harmony with the Giovanelli, the Bergadano, and the Fiorentini, it is not the same thing when the same type is proposed to support the Janssens, the Van den Bosch, or the Van Krimpen in Belgium, or again at the other end, the Ramirez da Silva and Gonçalves in Portugal. Obviously, there were also some very practical issues as well. Names in Portugal, for instance, tended to be very long and called for a more condensed typeface. That's what one thing he wrote, so that you could fit everything, all the details on one line. Consequently, Mandel's collaboration with ATypI resulted in the design of not 1, but 3 type families, which meant to cover the various needs of European countries. You have an overview, very short overview here of 3 designs he produced. You have on the left Lusitania, which was conceived more specifically for southern countries, or in this case more specifically for Portugal. On the very right, you have Nordica, which was to be used for northern countries or Anglo-Saxon countries such as the UK, Holland, Germany. And the one in the middle was named Linéal, which means sans serif in French. And it was meant to be a versatile sans serif companion to Nordica and Lusitania. As you might see here, even what he called a versatile sans serif ended up looking very Mandelesque, in my opinion. I'll get back to this in a second. And these are samples of the Portuguese and German directories, which used Lusitania at the top, Nordica at the bottom, and both use Linéal for setting addresses. Unfortunately, we don't have a better picture of these images, but it gives you an idea of the rendering of the letter forms after being digitized and after being printed at small size on rough paper. I don't think it would have got better than that anyway. Interestingly, Mandel's decision to produce different designs for different countries can be partly understood as a reaction against the trend for sans serif designs, such as Helvetica and, of course, Univers. As you may remember, we mentioned at the beginning that Mandel's first job was to help Frutiger to produce the variants of Univers. And so for us, it's very intriguing to see that by the end of his career, Mandel was publishing this kind of drawings. He complained against the bottleneck of the single-thought mind. And I don't know if you can see very well on this drawing, but you have all these different typefaces coming in. You have the bottleneck of the single-thought mind, and then everything looks like Univers. And so it's as if Mandel was kind of rebelling against his master, so to say. He was kind of killing the father. Whereas Frutiger had attempted to conceive a universal typeface, and a very successful one, Mandel in turn felt the need to re-establish cultural differentiations in letter forms. There is a lot to say about this. We don't have time to talk about it today, but that's also one aspect of Mandel's work that we are currently investigating. It is a rather complex aspect because it involves also some deeper social and political issues to some extent, but yeah, that's something we are currently looking into. All we thought we would say now is that despite this claim of kind of cultural differentiations, we can strongly feel Mandel's personal touch in all of his designs. Here are some lowercase letters that we took from many of his typefaces. Some were designed for telephone directories, and some were made for continuous reading, such as his typeface Messidor, which is the first one at the top left, and Aurelia, which is the fourth one, so the bottom left one. I think you can clearly see a strong humanistic influence in all of them, which reflects Mandel's wish to bring back humanistic letter forms to the forefront. And you see as well the kind of the strong horizontal emphasis in weight placement in all of his designs, which is something that Dorine mentioned earlier. And this flavor to us, which is very typical of Mandel, comes out more than any other cultural specificities, as you might call them. But yet we can't deny that his approach enabled him to give very different flavors to the phone books of different countries. Even in very small sizes, these different flavors come out and provide a very distinctive feel, quite far from the kind of uniform functionalism that we might usually associate with phone books. And I think he did successfully bring an unexpected flavor to an object that's essentially seen as functional. And that will be our conclusion, but yeah, just, you know, as type designers, we're often asked if there aren't already enough typefaces, blah, blah, blah. And some type designers recently talked about this kind of infilism thing. So we're not going to get into that debate here, but it's just to us, a project like Galfra is a perfect example that there probably won't be ever enough typefaces simply because the reading context changed, the technologies changed, and with them the set of constraints and of opportunities to develop new type designs constantly evolve. Telephone directories are pretty much becoming a thing of the past. There are new challenges awaiting type designers and typographers who learn to transpose these objects online and on screen, and there's still a lot of work to be done on that. But yet we believe that studying projects such as these ones can teach us some kind of lesson, which is that no matter how drastic or how severe the constraints are on the design, whether they are technological constraints or economical or legibility constraints, there can always be some room for some kind of unexpected answers, for creativity, for a certain degree of expressivity in typeface design, and we think that the typefaces designed by Mundel for telephone directories are a very good example of that. Thank you.